All right, well, we're continuing with our series for this month covering Unity Basics, and we're doing that in honor of our co-founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who were both born in August. Now, when I say basics, I'm talking about our 5 basic principles, which were written 20 or so years ago by Connie Fillmore, who is the great-granddaughter of the Fillmores. And our principles are exactly that. They're principles. They're not a statement of faith. They're not a creed. They're not meant to be treated as dogma. Beware of dogma. We work with them, we question them, and if necessary, we make some changes, which is exactly what we did here at Unity of Auburn, along with other centers. Language that worked well 20 years ago might not mean the same thing in the context of what we know today. And so far, we've covered the first 2 principles. And the way we say the first principle here at Unity of Auburn is like this. Did we have the first one?
Yeah.
Didn't show up. Well, I've got it right here. God is the name we give to the source and essence of all that is. There is no other enduring power. And the reason that Emily Cady quote is up there is because the way we state the first principle here is consistent with the way Emily Cady wrote it back in the late 1800s. It comes from one of her writings, part of the book Lessons in Truth, where she says, God is the name we give to that unchangeable, inexorable principle at the source of all existence. God is a name. All existence is based in principle. God is a name that we human beings use to describe the network of rules, laws, and principles that made this universe possible and govern its operation. And you can use many other names, and people do. A few years ago, I discovered the work of a theologian, Gene Marshall, who gives us a very important question to work with. He says that instead of asking whether or not God exists, we should instead ask this question: what reality are we pointing to with the word God? What reality are we pointing to? You can still use the word God. The most important thing is to get in touch with what reality you are pointing to when you say that word. And if another word works better for you, then it is your right and your privilege to use that word interchangeably. I like to say that my God is reality. All of it. Not just the stuff I like, not just the stuff that I understand, but the whole catastrophe, as they say, from roller coasters to earthquakes. All part of the same reality. And if that sounds perhaps a bit, cold and impersonal, consider what this scientist has to say about reality. He says, the universe is a continuous, radiant, numinous revelation, contemplating the wonders of the unfolding creativity of the cosmos is a mystical, ecstatic, awe-inspiring event. Now that's what I call personal. It's powerful. It most definitely is not cold. I would call that almost a passionate statement. And that's from Brian Swim. He's a mathematical cosmologist who teaches in San Francisco. So what this tells us is that reality, or the universe, or whatever you want to call it, can be as personal and as awe-inspiring as we want it to be. It all depends on where we look and how we look. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our third principle. So last week, I think we started to see how these principles build on each other. One flows from the next, and they form this coherent matrix. We start out by saying that God is the source and essence of all that is. We say all. Notice that. We say all. Not just some things, but everything, and that means every single one of us. So our second principle flows smoothly from the first. God as source and essence of all that is means that human beings are expressions of God. And this principle can be rather easily misunderstood by people. A few years ago, Karen and I were at a regional conference down in Monterey, and Michael Moran, who at the time was the senior minister at the Spiritual Life Center in Sacramento, was telling the story of something that happened when they first started holding church services in downtown Sacramento many years ago. He would notice two people, a man and a woman, sitting in the front pews, I guess at that time, of the church that they were using, and they'd sit there during the service with their eyes closed. And every Sunday they'd show up and they'd sit there with their eyes closed. And he found out later that they were from the Baptist church that was down the street. Apparently their minister at the Baptist church had requested volunteers from the congregation to go down to that strange new church that just opened up down the street where people think they're God. They were supposed to go there and pray for the lost souls who have the audacity to think that they're God. That's what they were doing. So you can see some people really take that concept and run with it, saying that we are God or we are co-extensive with God. If that's the case, then we really should know exactly what happened to cause the Big Bang. What was it that existed moments before the Big Bang to cause that to happen? And as far as I know, nobody claims to know anything of the sort. Being an expression of God is not the same thing as claiming to be God or be coextensive with God. So, in truth, all things are expressions of God, and human beings bring something special into the picture. And that something special is this self-reflective consciousness that we experience. Human intelligence is an aspect of consciousness, and that intelligence enables us to create things that you just don't find in the natural world. Last week we talked about how the universe really knows nothing about justice and fairness, at least according to our human definition or notions of justice and fairness. When a large star begins to run out of hydrogen fuel to keep the fusion reaction going, that star is going to explode. It's going to go supernova. It doesn't matter how many people, how many nice people might be on the nearby planet. Those people need to get out of the way if they can, because the laws of physics govern what's going to happen. It doesn't matter if it seems unfair or unjust that such a bad thing would happen to such nice folks on that planet. Things like love, justice, compassion, and fairness are what consciousness bring into the picture. Our second principle means that we are co-creators. Human values, justice, and fairness, they don't exist in nature. Now, it's true, you will see in some, you watch these Facebook videos that go around of animals supposedly helping each other out, animals exhibiting altruism is the word. And we have to be kind of careful about that when we see those videos, because there was that word I mentioned last week, anthropocentric, which means that we have this tendency to evaluate everything in terms of our own human experience. And that may not be valid. There's one Facebook video in particular that's kind of gone viral. You might have seen it. It's from the Budapest Zoo. There's a bear in one of these outdoor enclosures that's surrounded by a water moat, and a crow somehow got in the water and was drowning. It was flopping around in the water and squawking, and it was kind of sad to see. And the bear comes over to the edge of the moat and reaches down with its big clawed paw and hauls this crow up out of the water and drops it at the edge of the moat and then goes back about its business. And everybody was remarking, oh my gosh, wasn't that a wonderful example of altruism? And I guess the crow dried off and flew away later on, but you could see in the video that when this happened, the bear was right in the middle of its lunch, literally. There's all this food scattered all over the place. There's carrots and there's chunks of meat and things like that out there. I suspect that maybe if this bear had not been so well fed, that perhaps that crow might have been a welcome snack. But why would you want to try to eat this feathery, bony old crow when you got all this great food over here? I suspect the noise that the crow was making was probably interrupting the bear's lunch, and he just wanted it to be quiet. So there's all sorts of interpretations we can make. But I think it's safe to conclude, whatever that represents, altruism in the natural world is an exception, not the rule. But in human affairs, we want altruism to be the rule and not the exception. Hence, the golden rule, part of the moral and ethical teachings of every single religion that we know of. It's not found in nature, but it seems to naturally emerge from human consciousness. That's a big deal. By right of consciousness, we are co-creators, and if we want things like justice and compassion, we have to create them. So, starting place, consciousness, which brings us to our third principle. Our thoughts, which is part of our consciousness, our thoughts create our experience of life. We sometimes hear this called the law of mind action, and there's a little rhyme that we can use to help us to remember it. We say it this way: thoughts held in mind tend to produce after their own kind. It's very important to remember the word tend. That's why it's up there in bold and in italics. They tend to produce after their own kind. Our thoughts do not produce reality. They do not create reality. There's no magic here. If I think I want a pizza, I have to go out and either buy it or make it at home. There's thought involved, but there are also lots of other action steps. Principle, like pizza, doesn't allow us to skip steps. I can be thinking about pizza for the rest of the service, and when I get home, I can pretty much guarantee you that I'm not going to find one in the oven. And if I do, I'll be sure to let you know. But that's not the way it works. I'm going to have to take some interim steps. Our thoughts don't create reality itself. They create our experience of reality. We attract ourselves to people, situations, and things through the beliefs, the attitudes, and the thoughts that we hold, both conscious and unconscious. It's not about controlling things out there. It's about getting ourselves in alignment with the creative principles that are at work in the universe all the time. We allow those principles to work through us, and we do that by the quality and content of our thoughts held in mind. Thoughts and beliefs, they're important, so we need to be aware of what we think and what we believe. We want to master our thought process rather than let it rumble along on autopilot, which is what happens so often. That's what leads us into our fourth principle. Prayer is creative thinking that puts us in touch with what it means to be an expression of God. We use that as a consciousness conditioning tool to get us in touch with and in alignment with these principles, and to begin to become intentionally aware of what's going on in mind. All right, that leads to a big question. How much control do we really exercise over our thought process? Do we consciously and intentionally regulate the content of our thoughts? Because based on what we just heard, that would seem to be very, very important. If we're co-creators, that would be very important. And we can go back even before the time of the Buddha. And we can find this quote in the ancient Hindu scriptures. The Bhagavad Gita describes the tendency of mind as follows. They say, for him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends. But for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. Something that humans have instinctively gotten. And that's from the place where we believe that the practice of meditation originated in the Indus Valley, that gave rise to the great Indian and Hindu scriptures. This is where having a meditation practice becomes so important, because at the most basic level, meditation is about observing everything that arises in us and around us from moment to moment. Whenever I teach a meditation class, the most common complaint I hear from people is that, oh, I can't meditate because my mind is too busy. I have all these thoughts, this constant dialogue, and it's so distracting that I can't meditate. And they're very disappointed when I tell them that that's the whole point. That's the whole point. Meditation is not about enlightenment. I'm pretty much jettisoning that word enlightenment. It's about waking up, becoming more mindful and more aware, and there is no ultimate and final stage in that. Meditation isn't about enlightenment, it's not about vision or visions, it's not about profound messages, it's about wading into that noisy and messy river of our own jumbled thoughts. And the noisier and messier that it is, the more important it is that we dive in and really start to look at it and to listen and to see what's going on. Remember what the ego wants to do. It wants to control everything, if possible. And this is an interesting trick. The ego tricks us into believing that we can't be successful at meditation until we control our thoughts and actually stop that noisy and messy river. And of course, when we don't, we quit, right? We stop, we give up the practice entirely. And who does that leave in charge? The ego, which is just what it wants all along, right? Interesting how that works. The ego has all sorts of tricks to keep us from simply being in the moment and observing our thoughts, like we see in this drawing here, this cartoon. The meditation teacher is saying, "Be here now." There's a guy in the back row with his cell phone. He says, "Yeah, I'm here at the retreat. I think I'm finally getting it." You think so? Probably not. What the ego doesn't want us to know, and why it keeps trying to distract us like that, is because when we dive into that noisy and messy stream and river of our thoughts and stick with it and look at them as they arise and flow by, we start to notice that there are spaces between the thoughts. And then we begin to learn that we can pause, we can rest in those spaces, and as we do that, the gaps between the thoughts become larger, the noisy stream starts to slow down a little bit, and we can actually observe it without getting swept away in it. After that, we begin to learn how to exercise a degree of conscious control, more so than before, a degree of conscious control over what we do with our thoughts and our impulses, and really decide just exactly what it is that we want to co-create with our precious gift of consciousness. Instead of our thoughts turning into words and actions without any intention behind them, meditation gives us a degree of control so that we can become better co-creators. So, once we make that decision, once we decide exactly what it is that we want to do with our precious gift of consciousness, that's when it's time for action. That's the fifth principle, and that will be our topic next week. See you then.